Austrocedrus chilensis, also known as its common name the Chilean cedar or the Cordilleran cypress, is a member of Cupressaceae. Austrocedrus is actually a monotypic genus within Cupressaceae, and it is a gymnosperm, so this is a conifer. It is native to the mountains in central southern Chile and southwestern Argentina. You can see the distribution highlighted here with these gray areas in the visual aid. And it's unique because it occupies a very narrow range. So this range is not wider than about 50 kilometers, parallel to the Andes. And it's also unique because it's a very wide latitudinal range of any other conifer. It occupies a very wide variety of habitats. The habitats include some continuous forest, which are the ones that are shaded in gray on this map. And those continuous forests tend to be the more humid to mesic forests, where they are either occurring as a dominant species with Nothofagus trees, the southern beech, or there are monotypic stands of just dense Austrocedrus chilensis. And then there's this other habitat and member there where the Austrocedrus chilensis are growing in these like fragmented forest populations, occurring in these like really isolated small groups in the steppe environment. And so I have these two kind of different habitats shown in these images. So you have a really beautiful glacial lake by the Andes here versus out in the Patagonian steppe with very few isolated stands. And so because of this habitat variation, you have Austrocedrus chilensis growing in sometimes only 300 millimeters of mean annual precipitation all the way to 3,000 millimeters of mean annual precipitation. Lots of different elevation gradient as well. And the soils that these trees grow in are these like rocky, well-drained soils that are of volcanic origin. And the unique distribution is probably driven by glaciation as well as fires from volcanism. And that's probably reduced the range to current range and started genetic drift and bottlenecks. So I'm going to be talking more about that as we go on. So as you can see, the Austrocedrus chilensis is a tree. It ranges from being these tall, about 40-meter conical trees in the dense stands to out in the open woodlands. You can get these multi-stemmed trees, which are unique. And those are in the more arid environments. They're very long-lived, so they can be up to over 1,000 years old, but more commonly they are not more than 500 years old. And these trees are dioecious. So that means that they have male and female trees, and they strictly can only outcross for sexual reproduction. So this leads to high within population diversity. With the Patagonian like steppe habitat trees, those populations actually has been shown that random mating does not occur. So in these like clumped populations, you're getting the chance that the trees in those little populations are only going to be pollinated by trees within that population and not dispersing their seeds very far, which could lead to inbreeding. And so that has kind of been shown, but at the same time, you have these like peripheral populations that have restricted gene flow in the harsh conditions that can actually reproduce clonally. So remember I talked about the multi-stemmed trees. Those are actually like vegetative propagation with like branch layering, but that is a kind of unique phenotype. It's not a common like method. It's more of an adaptation for reproduction. And so just coming back to looking at the map, I forgot to mention like the red dots are just showing like the like more like isolated dispersed chilensis habitats as opposed to like those major zones that have like the dense forests. So looking at reproductive allocation, we know that these are Iteroparis, so these trees reproduce annually once they're sexually mature. And so I'll get more into that when we talk about the phenology. But the female cones typically start to develop on the tree around age 15 to 25 years. And I did see that for allocation in male versus female, because they are dioecious, that there is a difference. So females are investing like 4 to 25 times more into biomass for reproduction, investing more carbon and nitrogen, which is something common for dioecious species, than the males. The females are. The males sometimes do grow faster, but not always the case. And in terms of the different climatic variables, there's no like differences in male versus female correlations with those variables. So I thought that was cool. In terms of pollination mechanism, they're anemophilous, so they are wind pollinated, dispersal pollination. Anyways, their pollen can only be distributed so far, so they're somewhat locally restricted, especially compared to other conifers. This is because they have non-saccate spherical pollen, as opposed to like a saccate pollen, which would travel much farther. And one study that described that this has like high pollen movement said that it was dispersing about 1,000 meters, so I didn't really think that that was very far. And so you still get these like low levels of genetic differentiation among the patches, like among the different populations, like despite the patchy distribution. And what this suggests is that there could be like individuals between the patches that actually act as like gene flow bridges, and are effectively like connecting those populations like genetically, which I thought was interesting. And like a really key thing with the environment that has to do with pollination is the wind patterns in these areas, because there's really strong westerly winds throughout this area. So it's a really dominant wind pattern. But one study showed that they actually saw that like the genes were flowing north-south. And so like within like these lower regions, you actually have like local topography, which can be allowing to kind of override those westerly winds and like allow north-south pollen transfer and like connecting those steppe forest patches. When it comes to seed dispersal, they are also wind dispersed and hemachoric. They have winged seeds that are about 3 to 5 millimeters long. And what was interesting about the environment there is that I found that during the timing of the seed dispersal is the one time where the western winds are 20% less frequent. So that might be actually allowing gene flow to happen to where you might be getting more east to west gene flow, where otherwise you might think it wasn't possible. In terms of phenology, the male cones, they tend to develop in August to December. The male cones begin to develop in August, and then they disperse pollen in September, so right at the beginning of spring. And peak pollen dispersal happens 2 weeks earlier than peak female cone receptivity. And those cones upsize after dispersal, but they can also stay retained on the tree for up to year to year in mild climatic conditions. The female cones tend to develop in over a broader range from August to December. And I have an image here showing the female cones. So these are the immature cones. They're actually photosynthetic, and then after they disperse, they dry out. So the pollination, again, mainly occurring in September. The cones maturing January to February, which is summer, staying green until they split open and release the seeds, and seeds are released all at once, summer to early fall. And so the timing of this dispersal is probably calibrated to those optimal wind conditions for the transfer, as I mentioned.